So, welcome everyone to our free clinical conversation. And Tracy Jarvis here, the director of PESI. And we have the fantastic expert therapist and author Arielle Schwartz joining us from the US. And we're going to be talking about the psychological and physiological repercussions of trauma and complex trauma. So, Arielle, welcome to our webcast today.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So let's start off, and we're just going to start off very with some basics. Just perhaps outline the difference between trauma and complex trauma.
Sure. So I think so many people nowadays are familiar with trauma and really specifically speaking about an incident that happens that's overwhelming to the senses. It's overwhelming to our mind and our body. We can't process it. And as a result, it leads to, repercussions of symptoms that linger. And not every event that we might objectively say is traumatic leads to trauma in an individual. But what we want to attend to is what is the individual's experience after that event? And is it indeed overwhelming? Now, when we talk about complex trauma and your question here, what we're really looking at is the experience of repeated ongoing events. And sometimes those events are themselves objectively quite traumatic. We look at, the events of ongoing abuse. We look at events of ongoing experiences of discrimination and racism, right? That's so prevalent in our world. Or we might look at the experience of domestic violence and how it persists over time. And sometimes what we look at with complex PTSD is the accumulation of much more subtle events that are, again, overwhelming to the senses, especially when we're looking at early childhood, and the experience of neglect, the experience of not being understood, not being accepted for who you are. And while any one of those events might not fall into the category of what we typically think of as trauma, but over time, because it impacts the sense of self, the identity, it actually can have very similar repercussions of traumatic symptoms that linger. And often what I've found over the years of working with individuals with complex trauma is that they discount their experience. Why should I feel this way? I didn't experience, a fire or a flood or an earthquake, right? So they're discounting that subtle accumulation, and that a lot of the work ends up being around validating that those experiences were real.
Yeah, yeah. So what I hear you saying is that it's an individualistic process. I think trauma affects people differently. Um, and so talk about perhaps some of the psychological repercussions of, and I'm talking PTSD, so that's post-traumatic stress disorder, as opposed to just experiencing trauma.
Right, right. And I'm glad you make that distinction. And one of the language pieces when we talk about trauma and PTSD is that, first of all, if we back out of the word disorder for a moment and speak about post-traumatic stress, that we want to, in a way, depathologize this a little bit and really understand that if you've experienced something that is traumatic for you and you're having lingering symptoms, that's understandable, that's something that you don't want to blame yourself for your own symptoms. And so we want to come at this with a sense of compassion and understanding that a lot of these symptoms, and I'll speak about them here in a moment, are physiologically based, and we can't think our way out of it. So for example, the re-experiencing type symptoms that are quite common after traumatic stress are experiences of nightmares or flashbacks. But often re-experiencing isn't something just specifically about the memory, but it's a felt sense. It's a somatic experience and it's an emotional experience. And it's one that can feel really overwhelming, can lead us to feel shaky or trembly, not sleep well, lose our appetite. So it's a felt experience that if you're blaming yourself for the symptoms, it actually can compound it. Whereas the biggest hope about a trauma-informed understanding for yourself, or if you're working with others, is to really recognize that that's beyond your control. It's your body's way of trying to protect you. What can be so tricky about these re-experiencing symptoms is that they themselves then become overwhelming. And so there's the traumatic event, and then there's the overwhelm of the symptoms. And so then we fall into the next category of symptoms when we look at PTSD, which is avoidance. And so we start to go into shaping our behaviors to avoid people or places or situations that bring up those uncomfortable feelings. So we start to shrink our lives, shrink what we're exposing ourselves to. And all of this is a way of protecting ourselves, but it can backfire because over time it can lead us to really kind of truncate or shrink down our lives to a degree where we're not fully living. We're not able to feel as free as we'd like to feel in the world. Another layer of symptoms that will help us distinguish between some of these different kinds of post-traumatic stress is that we talk about high arousal symptoms, anxiety, restlessness, agitation, but then also there are low arousal symptoms. So experiencing hopelessness, fatigue, depression, are also common after traumatic exposure. And sometimes this gets talked about as kind of two different kinds or two different presentations of PTSD.
I really like what you said there, because I think what you're saying, what seems to make sense, is that, many of the post symptoms of a traumatic event, if someone is having post symptoms, are things like, disorganization of their kind of nervous system. So things like high anxiety, or, really kind of low states like depression, or, other disorders, which are actually nothing wrong with the person, but something that happened as a result of the original experience.
Yes. So often, and this is why I'm drawn to the polyvagal theory and looking at trauma through that lens, is that what it helps us understand is the physiological dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system after trauma exposure. And that while there are ways to work with our autonomic nervous system in regards to the breath and working with the body and being able to reestablish regulation, but until we have those skills, the autonomic nervous system functions independently. It functions automatically, right? And it's driven by the lower brain centers that are oriented towards survival. And that's very wise. Your body is doing some really important things to try and protect you, even though it can feel like your body's betraying you because the symptoms are so uncomfortable.
Mm. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because we've actually got Deb Dana on polyvagal theory for a workshop next Saturday. So maybe a bit of a technical question, but why emotional dysregulation within the autonomic nervous system? So like, why do we as humans become like emotionally dysregulated? Can you say just a little bit about that, and maybe the limbic area and things?
Well, one thing that I would offer is that the word dysregulation, and again, I'm going to play with our language a little bit. It's a bit of a term that again can lead us to go towards self-doubt or self-blame for our symptoms. And what the body is attempting to do is to find resolution. All right. So if we think about trauma, it's an impact on the somatic experience in the body that is incomplete. So if we look at animals in the wild and we study how animals respond to frightening events, when they've escaped, when they've returned to a sense of safety, the animal is going to shake it out, it's going to tremble, it's going to release that freeze from the body, and it's going to basically come back to homeostasis. But as humans, we have gotten a lot of conditioning out of the honoring the somatic experience. And so as a result, we tend towards stillness and we tend to override the somatic impulse that would bring us to a sense of completion. And when we were speaking about complex PTSD, that can be further reinforced when there has not been opportunities to reestablish safety because the trauma is repeated and ongoing. But one of the ways that affect dysregulation, if we use that term, is perpetuated is by those avoidance symptoms. Because as a result, we're basically becoming quite phobic of the internal somatic experience and our emotions and reminders of the trauma. And so we begin to avoid those situations and people and places that are reminiscent. And then we start to truncate our window of tolerance. Avoidance eventually takes us into being able to handle less and less over time. And it reinforces the idea that we can't handle it and that indeed it's bad and fearful.
Yeah, yeah. And, you spoke about sort of trauma being stored in the body and that impulse to complete, that activation needs to go somewhere and it needs to sort of complete. Say a little bit about that regarding to sort of more developmental trauma or injury, because sometimes there's not necessarily the impulse, but then there's the could be sort of socialization around, for example, neglect, or if someone is treated in a particular way, maybe not sexually abused or violently abused, but just sort of neglect and not sort of treated right, or emotional neglect. Can you sort of say how that is sort of stored in the body?
Yeah. So if you imagine a child that is reaching out for connection, and initially that biological drive that's a seeking drive, that's seeking connection, seeking attachment, um, it's driven internally. It's something that infants don't have to be taught, right? It's an innate response, and so we seek out our attachment and our connection to others, except that in an experience of ongoing neglect, when a caregiver is not available for that connection, the initial response is one of distress. The initial response is, I'm calling out and you're not there, and I'm going to call louder. I'm going to make my need more known. But if there is still no response, if the neglect persists, then the next level of responding is one of shutdown, because it's too painful to feel that longing for connection and that reach and that cry and that distress, and to have that not met, that it actually is a biologically, again, driven protective mechanism to dim down the felt experience of the pain of neglect. And so we'll actually roll over into an immobilization response, again, biologically driven, that says, I'm either going to self-soothe or I'm going to numb myself and dissociate from the pain of the disconnection. Usually it's a combination of both. And so the ongoing experience of how that gets held in the body is one of kind of a learned helplessness, an experience of no matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference. It's not going to establish connection and safety. And therefore, there's this deep loss of self-efficacy.
Say a little bit about how come people experience like phobic reactions to their traumatic material. So you're talking about it a bit earlier, that kind of, avoidance. But why does the human body do that? Perhaps talk about the wisdom of that, if I can reframe. Reframe it.
So when we're, someone the chats sometimes pop up and someone asks this question of, what do you mean a truncated window of tolerance? And I think it's connected here, that there is a way in which that the window of tolerance gets smaller, right? That what I can respond to effectively, if we think about what is a window of tolerance, it's my ability to respond to my sensations and my emotions in an effective manner, both internally, but also relationally. And so this experience of a phobic reaction, when we become afraid of our own feelings, it's because we have no strategy to successfully have that need met internally or out in the world. And when we have no strategy, the experience, once again, going back to that helplessness, is either one of great disorganization of kind of flailing attempts to reestablish safety and connection, because that's ultimately what creates resolution, is that I can feel safe in myself and in the world. And that safety is often a shared experience, that I know that I'm safe because I'm connected to you.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the things that I came across in my research on trauma that's related to this is the way in which our trauma response is always wise. It's always attempting to find resolution, right? And so there's a way in which the mind and body come together to try and predict future events and actually protect us now, not from what happened in the past, because that's over, but try and protect us from the potential that could happen again. And so as a result, in fact, we can even think of the primary purpose of all of our memories is to actually help us anticipate the future. What we look for when we're healing from trauma is actually to understand that these predictions are essential for our survival, right? If we go back in time and you're walking through the jungle and a tiger jumps out at you, and now you know there's tigers in the jungle, you want to go out on, the next time you go in the jungle, you're going to come better prepared. You're going to know like what you need to protect yourself in case the tiger jumps out. So the problem that happens with trauma is that, we're carrying around the prediction that there's tigers all around us, and often there aren't. Often the memories of the past were an outlying experience and will not necessarily repeat. I'm just thinking of a session I had yesterday with a woman who had experienced a tremendous betrayal in her previous marriage. She's divorced. But as she's trying to go into the world and develop new relationships, and she's dating someone and she's deepening in intimacy, she's struggling because she's preparing for the likelihood that he will betray her as her ex-husband did. And so she's going into these preemptive reactions and looking for, signs and signals of betrayal, even though they're not there. And it's very painful for her to feel like she can't let down her guard or let down this vigilance and allow herself to be safe in a now safe relationship. So what we need to do when we're healing is we actually need to suspend that predictive processing of the mind and the body. We need to actually observe and become the witness of, and be able to counterbalance those vigilant responses with new information that counters it. So that we can actually attune to the safety of the moment, even though we feel on guard. And we're cultivating cognitive dissonance when we see something that's not in line with our predictions. That cognitive dissonance facilitates neuroplasticity. It facilitates change.
So what I hear you saying is, for those therapists listening out, getting clients to notice new experiences which don't actually fit with what they thought might happen. and really noticing those moments like, oh, wow, that's different. That's different.
Right. And I think it's why therapy needs to be experiential, because we want to have the experience in the moment. We don't want to just talk about it. We want to feel it.
So I know we were talking about this earlier, but so many people talk about sort of physical symptoms or the physiological symptoms of trauma or adversity or PTSD. Maybe just rattle off several of those, because some people don't actually realize that what they are suffering from is either traumatic stress and adversity and or trauma, but they have things like, you're about to say what they are, but they have various sort of symptoms.
Sure. Sure. The first one that comes to mind is that high startle reaction. That a lot of people have. A loud noise, someone walks up to them from behind, puts their hand on their shoulder, and they jump, right? And in addition to that, restlessness, shakiness, agitation, irritability. And we're talking right now about some of the high arousal symptoms. But if we spoke earlier about the high arousal, but also some people's predominant trauma response is in a low arousal category. So for some individuals, trauma responses might look like dizziness, nausea, fatigue. I had one man that I've worked with for quite a while, and for a long time, the symptom doesn't show up anymore. But when he experienced a disconnect with another person, his primary experience afterwards was, in his words, to sit in his armchair, to fall asleep, and to go into what he called nothingness. Just everything would disappear. And what we learned in our work together is that his mother had postpartum depression. His experience as an infant was one of, there's nothing I can do that can get through to you. And the only resort was to disconnect. And he even brought photos of himself being held by his mother, who was like this, looking away with him in his arms, right? Or him in her arms. But that repeated over time. So that even though he can't remember per se that experience of the infant, but we have the photograph, but he can remember what it was like to be a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old, and nothing he did would get through to her. So what he needed to do was disconnect in a way, or get some distance from that young part of himself and the somatic experience of the learned helplessness, to be able to access that now can be different from then. And that in his relationships now, he can actually develop strategies that reestablish safety and connection in ways that he couldn't as a young boy with his mother.
Why do us humans, I know it's sort of different for animals, but why do us humans sort of experience the somatic symptoms of trauma? Like, why does it come out in those things that you've just mentioned?
Yeah.
In the body, through the body.
Yes. It's interesting. Actually, as humans, we have a lot of parallels to what animals do naturally, except that we override it. We've got a lot of conditioning that to be still is a sign of respect and a sign of obedience. And in fact, when you look at children, and David Berceli's work with the trauma release exercises in the body, when you look at children actually will allow themselves to shake and tremble after a frightening experience, so long as they feel safe and held by caring adults. They'll allow themselves to cry. They'll say that was really scary. They'll run around the room. They'll do something that releases it from the body, so long as, again, there's enough safety around the single event. But what can happen is that when a child is growing up in an experience of ongoing repeated trauma, where there isn't sufficient safety being held in relational experiences, that it accumulates, it builds up. And it builds up as chronic experiences of freeze, which is one of the somatic experiences that we haven't spoken about yet, but that experience of shutdown and frozenness in the body. And sometimes freeze can be in a high arousal state where you're hyper alert to everything. And sometimes that immobilization response is one of low arousal and a shutdown. But ideally, in response to trauma, when there's a release of cortisol, which is what the body does in a frightening event, is that we have some way to mobilize or metabolize that cortisol. So we'll feel it, we'll move, we'll run, we'll shake it out, we'll protect ourselves in some way. And it's interesting, I was even speaking with someone yesterday who was saying that so long as she feels like she has a course of action to take in a stressful event, she doesn't experience the stress afterwards. But it's when we feel like there's nothing that we can do that it builds up. And so when we are able to mobilize to protect ourselves or take action, we're basically allowing the body to come back to homeostasis. And of course, when we don't have those options, when we drop into either a frozen response or an immobilization response, there's this buildup of cortisol in the body. And, you know, one of the other repercussions of trauma that's unresolved are experiences of chronic pain and chronic illness.
Mm, mm. And we could probably talk for hours on just those 2 points. And I'm aware we've got 32 minutes left, which includes a Q&A. But hopefully next time, Arielle, because I think those are really 2 important points. And I want to briefly just sort of go on the edge of that. So how can people experience disturbing, or sometimes are left with sort of disturbing somatic sensations in the body? So these are sensations that they just totally feel uncomfortable.
Right. So, you know, one kind of catchphrase here, but I think it's worth saying, is that the body holds the memory of what happened, right? It's a lot of what Bessel van der Kolk writes about in The Body Keeps the Score. And so this recognition that the body is holding that truncated sequence, we can also say that the body holds the memory of what wanted to happen. So if the truncated sequence of I didn't get to flee the dangerous environment is held in the body, that there's also the experience of the unsequenced flee response, the unsequenced capacity to move. And Peter Levine, in his Waking the Tiger, shares the story about, well, imagine there's a tiger chasing you, and can you slow motion just allow yourself to move through your arms and legs and reclaim that flee response. Or perhaps the truncated sequence was one of, I didn't get to push someone off of me. Or maybe I didn't get to reach out and ask for connection and have that be responded to in a loving way, where I felt like my reach had efficacy. So when we're turning toward the body, what we're wanting to do is build tolerance for affect and for sensation at a pace that the client can tolerate. And so we want to ultimately be able to reclaim our ability to sense and feel, and to know that those sensations and the drive toward action can result in a new outcome.
Beautifully put. You spoke earlier around sort of learned helplessness and sort of efficacy. And I think it shows up with clinicians all the time. Say a little bit about sort of learned helplessness and perhaps the wisdom of that, even though right now it becomes a liability or it's maladaptive in the now, but back then, yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Yes, yeah. If you think about an infant, I'll just go very early, very young. An infant who is being abused has no ability to flee and has no ability to fight. That built-in defense protective mechanism isn't online yet, and it wouldn't be sufficient, even if it were, to protect them from an adult. And so there's wisdom in the shutting down, because once again, if the trauma and what we define as trauma is something that's overwhelming to the senses, then the best way to survive that is to dim down the senses. And that's where dissociation can really begin, is this early priming of the nervous system toward an immobilization response and toward dimming down the sensory experience. So, you know, over time, early trauma shapes the nervous system within a dangerous environment. This doesn't just happen in early childhood, though. If we look at some of the research about refugees who experience ongoing abuse or rejection, lack of protection from government, fear of deportation, what we see here is that there's a form of mental defeat and a giving up in one's own mind any effort to retain one's own identity as a human being, one's own capacity for willpower, because in order to survive, one has to submit. And the submitting is important and it's wise and it's a survival technique, but it's something that we can't stay in, or again, it's one of the, I think, the most painful ongoing trauma responses that happens, in part because it leads to a deep confusion about who's at fault. I think there's a tremendous amount of shame that accompanies that submissive response.
Yeah, and particularly that filter of younger people, which normally think, well, you know, it normally is a younger person's fault because that's how children think, right?
Right.
Yeah. So what should clinicians be doing, therapists be doing in their practice to sort of help a client move through sort of helplessness? And if we just sort of go in more to the dorsal vagal, the kind of shutdown. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because we've got a little bit more time than I thought.
Oh, good, good. I'm so glad. So, you know, I think that there's a lot of techniques out there for trauma recovery, but the research shows again and again that none of those techniques are sufficient without a good foundation of therapeutic relationship. And that so much of these early trauma experiences, and even what I just described with the refugee experience, is relational trauma. It's the experience of deep betrayal and lack of trust in our fellow human beings. So if we understand that the foundation of good trauma treatment is the relational exchange, then we're going to begin with our deep understanding of how attunement and acceptance and, you know, to borrow from Carl Rogers, our unconditional positive regard, our own deep understanding of another person within the context of their developmental experiences, their cultural experiences, their social experiences that have made them who they are. And our goal is to develop a very deep, compassionate understanding for the isness of this other person, for who they are and what's presenting body and mind and emotions. And ultimately, we can help them build their own capacity to have self-compassion and acceptance. But, you know, to borrow from Deb Dana for a moment, we understand that the co-regulation is what's needed that precedes the self-regulation. It's the experience of relational repair and relational safety that tends to precede our own internalization of that and our ability to attach to ourselves securely.
Mm-hmm. So what I hear you saying, and I completely agree with you, that, you know, as therapists doing your own personal work to remain completely present and calm when sitting with a client that is talking about X or Y and is totally activated is
Mhm.
absolutely key to helping heal their trauma because of that co-regulated state.
Yes. And you know, if I may, Tracy, I'll just toss in there that it doesn't mean that it's always calm. That part of what we're able to do when we have a widened window of tolerance, when we have a capacity for affect and sensation tolerance, is that sometimes we want to join our clients in the experience, not join in an overtaking way, but meet them in the experience of anger, legitimate anger, right? And to say, yeah, I can understand why you would feel that way, and let that rage be here, and that's safe here, and I can help hold that with you. So part of it might be really rising to actually meet the mobilization or the high arousal state in a way that doesn't communicate that we're afraid of it, but also doesn't stay totally removed. We can actually allow for a meeting of that in a very powerful way. And even sometimes going back to relational work, sometimes what I find as I provide supervision and consultation for therapists is that the biggest kind of way that therapy gets shut down is when therapists themselves are fearful of the client's anger, and therefore are basically doing this dance to make sure that the client never gets angry at them. As a result, we're actually recapitulating a wound, reenacting something that happened in the family of origin. So part of our own calm, as you say it, or our own capacity to be present is also to say, sometimes I'm going to get things wrong. And the most important thing for our relationship is that you know that you can tell me, and that it's okay to be angry with me sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. So that new experiences, as you were talking about earlier, can happen. So there's repatterning of the autonomic nervous system.
That's it.
Mm. We've got about 5 minutes left, and so glad to have you, Arielle, on this free webcast. Let's talk about the shame and the role of shame in post-traumatic stress. And I think stress, I think sort of two things. Again, sort of really looking perhaps at the wisdom of that and not seeing it as a disorder or that there's something wrong, but actually its function and its role.
Yes. Well, you said something really important before, which is that when something frightening is happening for a child, it's very confusing around who's responsible for that event. And so children experience everything from the ego center place, and also from an experience of magical thinking, which involves in a way feeling responsible for everything. You know, I can create the world as I'd like it, but when bad things happen, I'm also somehow creating that. So the misguided sense of responsibility is often what's underlying shame, and it can form into a cognition somehow of I'm at fault or I'm bad. But the felt experience of shame, and you know, for all of us, I'll say, because shame is such a universal human experience, is that we in some way or another kind of go into a shutdown. It's a binding emotion, and shame tends to result in kind of dimming down or binding other emotions, our access, for example, to healthy, legitimate anger, or our access to our grief. So there's one other perspective on shame that really landed for me. I worked for many years with Jim Knipe. He wrote a book on complex PTSD. He also wrote the foreword for the complex PTSD workbook that I wrote. And one of the things that he speaks about with shame is that shame can be thought of as a safe place. Now, it seems like an oxymoron, but what we're really referring to is the way that if I take responsibility, if I make myself the bad one, then first of all, maybe I have some pseudo power that I can change things. But by the safety of shame is that it actually drops me into a very uncomfortable place, but it dims down the fear response. It's a way of saying, I don't really have to admit that my parents were bad or scary or dangerous. I don't really have to admit that because I can just focus on this internal feeling of badness.
Yeah. So, and one of the things Janina Fisher talks about is like sometimes, it's unhelpful for clinicians to actually go down that shame hole with clients, and sometimes it's helpful. And I don't know, in your experience, sort of, how do you sort of work with shame? Because sometimes it can be really good to move through it with clients, and sometimes it can also just, well, as Janina says, sort of go somewhere else. So what do you make of working with shame in a way that is growth promoting within the autonomic nervous system?
Well, one of the pieces that actually connects really strongly to the comment you made before is that we don't want to shut down with our clients. That what can happen with shame is that it can evoke shame in us as well. And so sometimes a client will come in and they'll feel really upset because they're not getting better. And they feel like nothing is working, but it's being driven by their shame. And then what can happen is that they'll evoke a shame response in us as clinicians. We're not doing enough to help them. What's wrong with us? And I think that at that point we both shut down. So what we want to do when we want to feel successful at handling shame is we want to name it, but also help kind of differentiate from the part of self that carries the shame. Shame hypnotizes us to think that it's the whole story. And when we can differentiate from shame and see it as a part, and a part that is actually holding something important for the whole system, but it's not the whole story, then we can start to understand who's holding the shame, what part. In a few weeks, I'll be sharing a case when I do the presentation for you all in PESI UK, where I was working with a woman whose shame part was a little 7-year-old child part who couldn't speak up to her stepmom because her stepmom was very, very critical, very judgmental. Now, what we needed to do was understand how wise it was for that little girl to shut down, because in truth, we needed to validate that there was no way to get through to her stepmom. But then what we wanted to work toward is self-compassion for that little girl. And initially, and we see this so often with our clients, the initial experience is one of disgust, blame, anger toward the little girl for shutting down. Because of course, she's an adult in her 30s, and sometimes she still drops into that place where she loses her ability to stand up for herself or find her voice, and she feels just as bad as she did when she was that little girl. So, we'll talk a whole lot more in a few weeks about how do we unwind those situations so that we ourselves aren't shutting down or in some way reinforcing the belief that there was something wrong with them that they shut down.
Thank you. Let's go to Q&A. There are, I think there's quite a number of questions. So we're just getting some of the themes through. And, people just ask some great questions. I'm so glad everyone is on this webcast because we just all learn so much from one another. So first question, and I think this is something that a number of people have been asking. What's the difference between sort of actually, I'm going to just add something in. Talk about the difference between developmental injury, developmental trauma, and complex PTSD.
Okay. Well, let's just hold that they live on a continuum, and that it's not for me to say which category it has to fall in for the other person, because for somebody who experiences developmental injury and those repeated developmental injuries or trauma, it's a single injury can be lasting and carry all the way into adulthood and need attention just as much as repeated incidents do. So if we hold it all in a continuum, in a way, our treatment is very similar, because we're still going to come in towards understanding how do we bring in relational attunement and compassion? How do we help the client relate to the part of themselves that's holding the experience of the injury or the trauma or the ongoing repeated events of traumas? One thing I will say is that dissociation also lives on a continuum. And because dissociation is so predominant and common with early developmental trauma, we want to understand that, again, the treatment is still going to largely be the same in terms of how are we going toward the intolerable or the untouchable memory or felt experience, and building greater capacity to be with that, and building greater tools and resilience and flexibility of the nervous system.
Next theme, we are talking, there's a number of questions. I'm just trying to quickly put them all together. We're going to be talking sort of medical trauma. So let me just get through all this. So I think the easiest way to sort of bring all these questions into one is to talk about the link, or we think the link between trauma and actually what you were talking about earlier on, sort of illness, things like fibromyalgia, chronic pain, irritable bowel syndrome, various illnesses. Can you say a little bit more about your understanding of, activation carried on in our autonomic nervous system, and how that then has an impact on other systems in our body?
Yes, it's something, it's a deep area of interest of mine. And I end up, as a result, working with quite a few people, as I think many of you do, working with quite a few people who have chronic pain and illness conditions, and also early developmental trauma. So, just from an informational perspective, we can look at things like the ACE study and the understanding of how adverse childhood experiences have been correlated to illness and pain conditions in adulthood that are stronger correlations than diet, than smoking, right? That these are incredibly strong correlations of early childhood developmental trauma and incidence of heart disease and incidence of lung disease. And but then, as you're speaking about in terms of the connection between chronic pain conditions such as fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome, that there is a connection between how the body processes cortisol and how that is basically conditioned in the body as a result of trauma, and how that can contribute to health conditions in adulthood. So, for example, it used to be thought that PTSD was associated with high cortisol levels over time. But what they looked at in the research is that actually unresolved chronic trauma, it leads to chronically low levels of cortisol in bloodstream serum across a 24-hour period. So if we look at cortisol as it relates to circadian rhythm, normally we have a burst of cortisol in the morning and then it subsides. We all want to take a nap at 2 p.m. for our siesta, which many of us override in Western culture. And then, we have another little rise of cortisol in the afternoon, and then it dips for sleep. But with individuals with PTSD, they have a flattened circadian rhythm, which is basically saying that they're not getting the highs of the cortisol release and that they're basically subdued across that 24-hour period. As a result, they're having a harder time feeling able to mobilize and get exercise, and they're having a harder time sleeping. And one last piece about this is that because cortisol has an inverse relationship to the immune system, that high levels of cortisol lead to immunosuppression. However, what we're talking about is the opposite picture, that PTSD is linked to low levels of cortisol over time. And as a result, the immune system is actually left unchecked. What that means is that the immune system, if there's no virus, if there's no bacteria to target, the immune system actually will go toward healthy tissues in the body. And this is partially that link between trauma and autoimmune conditions. And what's so hard in this is that once there's a tipping point in the physiology of the individual, those autoimmune conditions are very hard to turn around. What we can do is increase capacity for self-care and in response to the vulnerabilities in the body, and as a result, get better care management around those health vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so much to think about, and sort of Nadine Burke-Harris has done sort of really an amazing job in kind of getting that ACEs into primary care settings. Let's hope it sort of happens in this country too. Let's talk about sort of medication and the role of medication in helping people, and I'm saying helping people, again, as a continuum, recover from sort of, you know, PTSD and complex PTSD, and perhaps talk a little bit about, you know, medication in terms of what it does to the ANS as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying that, you know, right now the recommended course of medication is falls mostly in the SSRI category.
In the US.
And the recommendations also suggest that the benzodiazepine category of medications are contraindicated for PTSD. And, you know, I'd love to do one of those show of hands here on Zoom. Like, how many of you have had clients that have come in with complex PTSD and who have been on Xanax or Ativan or one of their benzodiazepines for years, right? Sometimes 5, 10 years. And so because it was relatively newer that people understood that the benzodiazepines are contraindicated, there have been people that have been taking them for many years and who really struggle with getting off of them. But the challenge here is that the benzodiazepines are pushing the cortisols into that dorsal vagal state. They're pushing an individual down into the dorsal vagal. It actually, when benzos are given during an acute trauma, what happens is that it actually increases the likelihood that someone will develop PTSD.
Wow.
I know. So, you know, really what we're talking about is building an individual's affect and sensation tolerance rather than, you know, taking all of that uncomfortable feeling away, because what we're, in other words, we're reinforcing an avoidance behavior by every time I feel anxious and panicky, I'm going to take something to make that go away. And what we want to do is to know that there is someone who can ride the wave with us and help us know that I can ride the wave myself eventually. But right now, if you can be there and you can, and I'm feeling really scared and shaky and anxious, and you go, well, that's a normal response. What just happened wasn't okay. And let yourself feel that and let that move through you, and you're going to be all right. Yeah.
Say a little bit about, we've had a couple of questions come in. I'm just having a look here. Around some of the primitive responses in developmental injury or trauma, for example, like, you know, like a grasping or reaching, or I think there's 5 or 6, aren't there? So grasp, reach, pull. Can you just say a little bit about sort of those in trauma truncated responses and how that kind of plays out across the lifespan?
Yes. Well, so part of my background was studying the work of Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen and then Susan Aposhian in the body-mind centering work, and eventually the body-mind psychotherapy work of Susan Aposhian. And so what they take is the understanding of the developmental movements of an infant and toddler, and understand how these have these psychological correlates, right? So the first of these basic developmental reflexes or capacities is our ability to yield into safe contact with another, to ground into the earth, to be able to actually be heavy in relationship to gravity. That sense sets the foundation for all of our other developmental movements. Once we have our foundation, our grounding into the earth, we can push into the earth and find the length of our spine. That pushing eventually helps us mobilize into the world, right? We can crawl, we can, but that we have that push, and from the push, we can reach. And what happens sometimes is that if people are developing in an uneven fashion, they might have an overdeveloped reach that doesn't have the support of the push and the yield beneath that. And as a result, it's, one of the ways that I see that is that I reach for connection, I reach into relationship, but I lose myself. So when we can stay rooted in the core felt experience of self, then I can connect to you and not lose me. Right? Diana Fosha speaks about this in her AEDP of how do we stay in self and connect to other. Beautiful foundational practice, and for therapists, absolutely necessary, as you say, to help us stay grounded and calm and relationally available in the midst of connecting to our clients, especially if you're seeing multiple people throughout the day, to know that you can come home to self.
We'll take one more question.
Okay.
And let's kind of go into with this question. Let's look at kind of, it's almost like let's say the last maybe 5-10 years, we've seen this, we've seen the Bessels, we've seen the Janinas, we've seen Pat Ogden, we've seen Peter Levine, we've seen yourself, we've seen everyone kind of working with trauma. And I don't know, let's go to the analysts kind of, Freud and Jung and kind of those depth processes. So let's bring that together and talk about, well, how do people actually heal from complex trauma? Because it's so complex with everything we've spoken about, from, those kind of primitive instincts as a child through to any abuse that happens, as a toddler, adolescent, into later life. What are some of both the conscious and the unconscious processes to help heal trauma?
Yeah, well, I would say, like, my first response, which is in reference to your last statement there, is that we can think of the unconscious as the somatic experience from which we're not yet aware, right? So that the body holds access to a lot of what we would call the unconscious. But the other piece that I would say is that what's beautiful about the analytic traditions is this understanding that relationship forms the foundation, and that it's a long-term work, that we have a lot of emphasis in our world today, which is about fast is better, 6-session models, 12-session models. And I think that what we come back to more and more in this integration of trauma work, especially complex developmental trauma, is this recognition that it's actually long-term work. And that when we can advocate for the necessity of that and the value of that, if we think about the fact that it takes, 20 years or so for the human brain to fully develop, for the human body-mind integrity to be real secure in self. And when there have been, 18, 20 years of significant lapses in those needs getting met, and significant deficiencies there, that what we're doing, we only get to see a person in most of our work an hour a week, unless you're in the analytical model, in which case you might see them 4 or 5 times a week. But, you know, if you're working with someone with complex trauma and you're going, oh my gosh, I'm 4 years into treatment, this is really slow. The first thing I want to say is it is slow. And that, you know, what a beautiful opportunity to do deep long-term work with someone when we have that option and when there's financial support for that option. And I know that's not always the case.
Arielle, so grateful for your time today. And also, we're so lucky. We've got you joining our Woman Trauma and Mental Health Trauma Conference next week with, I think there's Janina, Judith Herman, Babette Rothschild, Pat Ogden, Kathy Steele. It's going to be fantastic. Can't wait to hear you and all that you've got to say. And I think we've got you as well in is it November, and near the end of November for is it a 2-day workshop?
Yes. Yes, we've moved it to a 3-day because of Zoom. So we're doing 4 hours a day. What is it? November 19th, 20th, and 21st. And I'm looking forward to both of those events.
Great. So if you're listening to this and you want to join us for sort of much more in-depth work with Arielle, do join us. Arielle, thank you so much, and see you soon.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.